So King Charles just rejected a request from Camilla, and the reason it shocked William is not that Charles said no, but that he said it in a way that made clear it was final. Because for as long as this family has been navigating its disputes, Charles has been the one who defers, who softens, who leaves questions open rather than closing them. He has been the manager of tensions, the avoider of hard decisions, the sovereign who would do almost anything to keep from delivering a definitive no to the woman he loves. And so when Charles rejected Camilla's request and rejected it with a finality that admitted no appeal, no negotiation, no reopening at some later date, William was stunned, because he had never expected his father to draw such a firm line, to close a question so completely, to deliver to Camilla the kind of final decision that Charles had spent his reign avoiding. Let me take you into what happened, because the significance is entirely in understanding what it means for Charles to make a decision that is truly final. To understand why Charles's final decision was so shocking, you first have to understand the pattern that has defined his reign, because Charles has never been a sovereign who closes questions. He has been a sovereign who manages them, who defers them, who leaves them open in the hope that time or circumstance will resolve them without requiring him to make a difficult choice. This tendency has been particularly pronounced in matters concerning Camilla. Charles's love for his wife, his desire to protect her, his reluctance to disappoint her, have made him especially unwilling to deliver definitive decisions that would run contrary to her wishes. He has deferred, he has softened, he has left room for negotiation and future reconsideration, doing everything possible to avoid the finality of a definitive no. This pattern has been so consistent that the family came to expect it, to assume that Charles would always find a way to avoid the hard final decision, which is precisely why his rejection of Camilla's request and the finality with which he made it was so stunning, because it broke the pattern. Charles did not defer, he did not soften, he did not leave the question open for future reconsideration. He rejected Camilla's request definitively, closing the matter completely, delivering the kind of final decision that he had spent his reign avoiding. And this departure from his established pattern signaled a significant change in Charles, a willingness to make the hard final decisions that his role required, even when those decisions ran contrary to the wishes of the woman he loved. The finality of the rejection was itself the shock, because it demonstrated a decisiveness that Charles had rarely shown. Before we go further, real quick, if you are into deep dives on royal stories that actually sit with the complexity instead of just picking a side, hit subscribe and join us here at Crown Watch. We are building something good. Okay, back to it. Here is what happened. Camilla made a request of Charles, a request concerning her position and her role within the institution. It was the kind of request that Charles had in the past tended to accommodate, or at least to defer rather than reject outright. Camilla had every reason to expect that Charles would, as he usually did, find a way to avoid a definitive no, that he would defer the matter or soften his response or leave room for future reconsideration. But Charles did not do what Camilla expected. He rejected the request, and he rejected it with a finality that made clear the matter was closed, that there would be no reconsideration, no negotiation, no reopening of the question at some later date. Charles had made a final decision, and the finality of it was unmistakable. The nature of Charles's rejection reflected a significant evolution in his approach, because for Charles to reject Camilla's request definitively, to close the matter completely, represented a departure from the deferral and accommodation that had characterized his handling of such matters in the past. Charles had, for once, made a hard decision, a final decision, a decision that admitted no appeal. And in doing so, he had demonstrated a decisiveness that his reign had rarely shown, a willingness to close questions rather than to leave them open, to deliver definitive answers rather than to defer them indefinitely. The finality of the rejection was a marker of this evolution, a sign that Charles had, at last, embraced the decisiveness that his role required. The way Charles delivered the rejection, by the accounts that have circulated, reflected the significance of what he was doing, because Charles did not reject Camilla's request through an intermediary or formal communication. He delivered the rejection himself, directly, in a manner that made clear both the decision and its finality. And in delivering it, Charles was careful to convey that the matter was closed, that there would be no reconsideration, that the question would not be reopened at some later date. This care reflected Charles's understanding that the finality of the decision was as important as the decision itself, that what made this rejection different from his usual deferrals was precisely its definitiveness. And so Charles took pains to ensure that Camilla understood the finality, that she recognized the matter was truly closed rather than merely deferred. The conversation in which Charles delivered the rejection must have been difficult, because Charles was doing something he had rarely done, delivering a definitive no to the woman he loved. There is no comfortable way to close a question so completely, to tell someone that a matter they care about is settled against them with no possibility of appeal. Charles could explain his reasoning, could frame the decision in terms of the institution's interests, could seek to soften the delivery even as he maintained the finality, but the fundamental reality remained. He was rejecting Camilla's request definitively, and no framing could disguise the finality of that rejection. Camilla would understand what the decision meant, would recognize that the matter was closed, would feel the weight of a definitive no from the husband who had always avoided such finality. What made Charles's delivery of the rejection particularly notable was his refusal to leave the usual openings. Because in the past, even when Charles had declined a request, he had tended to leave room, to suggest that the matter might be revisited, to soften the refusal with the implication that it was not truly final. This time, Charles left no such openings. He closed the question completely, made clear that it would not be revisited, delivered a rejection that admitted no appeal. And this refusal to leave the usual openings was itself the most significant aspect of the delivery, the marker of Charles's evolution from a sovereign who deferred to one who decided. He had, for once, delivered a truly final decision, and the completeness of its finality was what made it so remarkable. William's reaction to his father's final decision was, by the accounts available, one of genuine shock. Because William had watched his father defer and soften and avoid hard decisions throughout his reign, particularly in matters concerning Camilla, and William had, in a sense, come to expect that his father would always avoid the definitive no, that he would always find a way to defer rather than to close a question. So when Charles rejected Camilla's request with a finality that admitted no appeal, William was stunned. He had not expected his father to draw such a firm line, to close a question so completely, to deliver the kind of final decision that Charles had spent his reign avoiding. And his shock reflected the extent to which Charles's decisiveness departed from the pattern William had come to expect. The significance of William's shock lay in what it revealed about the change in Charles. Because William, who knew his father's tendencies well, understood immediately that the finality of the rejection represented something new, a decisiveness that Charles had rarely shown. William's shock was, in this sense, a recognition of his father's evolution, an acknowledgement that Charles had done something he had rarely done before, that he had made a hard final decision even in a matter concerning Camilla. And this recognition was significant because it suggested that Charles had at last embraced the decisiveness that his role required, that he had overcome the tendency toward deferral that had defined his reign. William's shock was the shock of witnessing his father become at last the decisive sovereign that the institution needed. Camilla's reaction to the final rejection reflected the weight of what it represented, because Camilla, like William, had come to expect that Charles would avoid definitive decisions, that he would defer or soften rather than reject outright. And so the finality of Charles's rejection was, for Camilla, a genuine blow. It represented not merely the denial of her request, but the closing of a question she had expected to remain open, the delivery of a definitive no from the husband who had always avoided such finality. Camilla had built her expectations on Charles's tendency toward deferral, and the finality of the rejection shattered those expectations, confronting her with a decisiveness from Charles that she had not anticipated. Her reaction reflected the depth of this shock, the recognition that Charles had for once closed a question definitively rather than leaving it open for her to continue to press. The question of why Charles evolved, why he chose this moment to embrace the decisiveness he had so long avoided, is worth considering because it illuminates the pressures that have shaped his reign. Because Charles did not become decisive by accident, something had changed, some accumulation of experience or pressure had brought him to the point where he was willing to make the hard final decision he had previously avoided. Perhaps it was the accumulated cost of his deferrals, the recognition that his tendency to leave questions open had allowed disputes to fester and tensions to persist. Perhaps it was the influence of William's example, the son's willingness to make hard decisions, demonstrating to the father what decisiveness could accomplish. Perhaps it was simply the passage of time, the gradual maturation of a sovereign who came to the throne late and who has been growing into his role. Whatever the cause, the evolution represents a significant development in Charles's reign, because a sovereign who learns to make hard decisions, who embraces the decisiveness that his role requires, is a sovereign who has matured into the fullness of his authority. Charles came to the throne after the longest apprenticeship in royal history, and there were those who wondered whether he would ever fully grow into the role, whether he would always be constrained by the tendencies that had defined his years as heir. His final rejection of Camilla's request suggested that he was, at last, growing into the role, embracing the decisiveness that his mother had embodied, becoming the sovereign that the institution needed. And this suggestion that Charles was maturing into the fullness of his authority was perhaps the most significant implication of his final decision. There is a poignancy in the fact that Charles' evolution came at the cost of disappointing Camilla, because the decisiveness that Charles embraced, the willingness to make hard decisions, required him to deliver a definitive no to the woman he loved. His maturation as a sovereign came at the expense of his role as a protective husband. And this trade-off between Charles's growth as a king and his desire to shield Camilla reflects the fundamental tension that has defined his reign, the tension between his duty as sovereign and his devotion as a husband. Charles's final decision resolved this tension, for once, in favor of his duty. But it did so at a cost, the cost of disappointing Camilla, and the poignancy of that cost is part of what makes the evolution significant. The deeper significance of Charles's final decision lies in what it reveals about the maturation of his reign, because for a long time, Charles's reign has been characterized by his reluctance to make definitive decisions, his tendency to defer and manage rather than to close and resolve. This tendency has been a source of ongoing difficulty because it has allowed questions to remain open, tensions to persist, disputes to continue without resolution. But Charles's final rejection of Camilla's request suggests that this tendency may be changing, that Charles may be embracing, at last, the decisiveness that his role requires. And this evolution, if it holds, represents a significant maturation of Charles's reign, a movement from the management of problems toward their resolution, from the deferral of decisions toward their delivery. This maturation has profound implications for the institution, because a sovereign who can make definitive decisions, who can close questions rather than leaving them open, who can deliver hard answers rather than deferring them, is a stronger sovereign than one who cannot. Charles's willingness to make a final decision, even in a matter concerning Camilla, suggests that he has developed this capacity, that he has embraced the decisiveness that his role requires. And this development strengthens his reign because it establishes that Charles will, when necessary, make the hard decisions that the institution needs, that he will close questions definitively rather than allowing them to persist. The finality of his rejection of Camilla's request was a demonstration of this strengthened decisiveness, a sign that Charles' reign had matured into something firmer and more capable than it had been. This strengthening carries implications not only for the present reign, but for the transition to William's reign that lies ahead, because a Charles who can make hard decisions, who can close questions definitively, is a Charles who can better manage the transition to the next reign. The disputes that have divided the family, the questions about the future that have remained open, have persisted in part because of Charles's reluctance to close them. A more decisive Charles, one willing to deliver final decisions, could resolve these disputes, could close the open questions, could establish clarity where ambiguity has prevailed, and this would serve the transition to William's reign, because it would allow William to inherit an institution in which the difficult questions had been settled rather than left open. Charles's evolution toward decisiveness could, in this sense, be a gift to the transition, a strengthening of the handover that will one day pass the crown to William. There is also a lesson here about the nature of authority and its exercise, because authority that is never exercised decisively can begin to seem like no authority at all. A sovereign who always defers, who never closes questions, who avoids hard decisions, can find that his authority erodes, that others cease to take his decisions seriously because they know he will not make the hard ones. Charles's final rejection of Camilla's request reversed this erosion, demonstrating that his authority was real, that he could exercise it decisively when required, that his decisions carried the weight of finality. And this demonstration strengthened his authority going forward because it established that Charles could and would make hard decisions, that his deferrals were a choice rather than an incapacity, that when the moment required decisiveness, he possessed it. It is worth considering the decision from Camilla's perspective, because while Charles's evolution may strengthen his reign, its immediate effect on Camilla was a painful one, because Camilla had made her request in good faith, believing it reasonable, expecting that Charles would, as he usually did, find a way to accommodate her, or at least to keep the question open, and to have the request rejected definitively, with a finality that admitted no appeal, must have felt like a betrayal of the understanding that had governed her relationship with Charles. Camilla had relied on Charles's tendency to defer, had built her expectations on his reluctance to disappoint her, and the finality of the rejection shattered those expectations, confronting her with a Charles she had not anticipated. There is a particular difficulty for Camilla in the timing of Charles's evolution, because Charles chose to embrace his decisiveness of all moments in a matter concerning Camilla. He had deferred and accommodated through countless other matters, and now, when the question concerned his own wife, he chose to be decisive. From Camilla's perspective, this timing must have seemed almost pointed, as though Charles had chosen to demonstrate his newfound firmness precisely at her expense. Whether this was Charles's intention or merely the circumstance in which his evolution happened to occur, the effect on Camilla was the same. She experienced Charles's growth into decisiveness as a personal rejection, a definitive no delivered at the moment when she most needed his accommodation. The impact of the rejection on Charles and Camilla's marriage can only be guessed at, but the strain must have been considerable, because Charles had done something that ran contrary to the pattern of accommodation that had characterized their relationship. He had delivered a definitive no, closed a question against Camilla's wishes, disappointed her in a way he had always avoided, and Camilla would have to absorb this. To reckon with the fact that Charles's decisiveness now extended even to matters concerning her, that she could no longer rely on his tendency to defer. The marriage would endure as it has endured other strains, but it would endure changed, marked by Camilla's recognition that Charles had grown into a decisiveness that would not always spare her, that his evolution as a sovereign had altered the dynamics of their partnership. For William, his father's final decision was, in a sense, reassuring, because William has worried throughout Charles's reign about his father's tendency to defer, to avoid hard decisions, to leave questions open, and Charles's final rejection of Camilla's request suggested that this tendency was changing, that Charles was becoming the decisive sovereign that the institution needed. This suggestion was reassuring to William because it indicated that Charles could make the hard decisions when they were required, that he would not always defer, that his reign was capable of the decisiveness that the institution's challenges demanded. William's shock at the finality of the rejection gave way, in this sense, to a recognition that his father's decisiveness was a positive development, a sign that Charles's reign had matured into something stronger. Catherine's place in the aftermath of Charles' decision reflected her characteristic restraint, because Catherine, whose own position was strengthened by Charles's willingness to make definitive decisions, did not celebrate the outcome or seek to capitalize on it. She understood the significance of Charles's evolution, the maturation of his reign that his final decision represented, but she also understood the pain that the rejection had caused Camilla, and she responded to that understanding with the discretion that has always defined her. Catherine recognized the value of Charles's decisiveness for the institution without treating Camilla's disappointment as a triumph. Her restraint reflected her recognition that the family's cohesion mattered even amid the disputes that divided it, that a decision which had caused pain called for compassion rather than celebration. The reaction of the wider family to Charles's final decision reflected their understanding of its significance. Princess Anne, who has long believed that the institution requires a decisive sovereign, regarded Charles's final decision with approval, because Anne understood that Charles had done what the institution needed, that he had made a hard decision, closed a question definitively, embraced the decisiveness that his role required. Anne's approval reflected her recognition that Charles had matured into a stronger sovereign, that he had overcome the tendency toward deferral that had characterized his reign. And Anne's approval, coming from the family member most committed to the institution's strength, confirmed that Charles's final decision represented a positive development, a maturation of his reign into something firmer and more capable. Edward, characteristically, understood Charles's decision in terms of its significance for the institution's stability, because Edward, who values the institution's strength above all, recognized that a decisive sovereign was a source of that strength, and he understood that Charles's willingness to make a final decision, even in a matter concerning Camilla, represented a strengthening of his reign, a movement toward the decisiveness that the institution required. Edward's understanding, aligned with Anne's approval, reflected the consensus among the family's institution-minded members about the value of Charles's evolution, the significance of his movement toward decisiveness, the strengthening of his reign that his final decision represented. There is an echo in all of this of the example that Charles's mother set, and the comparison illuminates the significance of his evolution. Because Elizabeth was, above all, a sovereign who understood that the crown sometimes required hard decisions, that the duty of the sovereign was to serve the institution even when service demanded difficult choices. She made such choices throughout her reign, subordinating her own preferences to the demands of the crown, delivering hard decisions when they were required, and she did so with a decisiveness that became the standard against which subsequent sovereigns would be measured. Charles, throughout his reign, had struggled to match that standard, particularly in matters concerning Camilla, where his love for his wife had made him reluctant to embrace the decisiveness his mother had embodied. His final rejection of Camilla's request suggested that he was at last growing into the decisiveness that Elizabeth had exemplified. He was making the hard decision, delivering the definitive answer, embracing the firmness that his mother had brought to her reign, and in doing so, he was demonstrating that he could, when the moment required it, match the standard she had set. This demonstration was significant because it suggested that Charles was becoming a worthy successor to Elizabeth, a sovereign who understood, as she had, that the crown must sometimes come before personal desire. The finality of his rejection was, in this sense, a coming into alignment with his mother's example, a demonstration that Charles possessed the decisiveness that the crown required. Whether Charles will sustain this decisiveness, whether his final rejection of Camilla's request represents a lasting evolution or merely an exceptional moment, is a question that only time will answer, because a single decisive decision does not necessarily indicate a permanent change. Charles might revert to his tendency toward deferral, might treat this final decision as an exception rather than a new pattern, or he might build on it, embracing the decisiveness he demonstrated, becoming consistently the firm sovereign that the institution needs. Which of these outcomes will prevail is uncertain, but the fact that Charles made the final decision at all, that he demonstrated a decisiveness he had rarely shown, suggests at least the possibility that his reign is maturing into something firmer, that he is growing at last into the fullness of his authority. So here is what I want you to sit with. Was Charles right to make a final decision to reject Camilla's request definitively rather than deferring as he usually did? Does his newfound decisiveness represent a positive maturation of his reign, a movement toward the firmness that the institution requires? Or did the finality of the rejection inflict an unnecessary harshness on Camilla, closing a question that a more accommodating approach might have kept open? And what does Charles's evolution suggest about the future of his reign, about whether he will continue to embrace the decisiveness he demonstrated, or whether this final decision was an exception to a pattern that will otherwise persist? There is no clean answer. And anyone who gives you one quickly has not sat with the full weight of what Charles' final decision represents. What we know is this: Charles rejected Camilla's request, and he rejected it with a finality that admitted no appeal. He departed from the pattern of deferral that had defined his reign, closing a question definitively rather than leaving it open. And in doing so, he shocked William, who had never expected his father to draw such a firm line, and he demonstrated a decisiveness that suggested the maturation of his reign into something stronger and more capable. The family, for better or worse, will live with the finality of this decision, with the question it closed and the evolution it represented. And the future of the monarchy has been given a sign that Charles, at last, may be embracing the decisiveness that his role requires, a decisiveness that could strengthen his reign even as it disappoints the woman he loves. The next chapter of this family is still being written, and when it moves, we will be here to talk about it. If this video made you see any part of this story differently, drop your position in the comments. I read every one of them. And on a question this complicated, I genuinely want to know where you land. Subscribe if you are not already with us, because the next chapter is coming, and it is going to be one worth watching.